The idea of the first Thanksgiving is not as romantic as we talk about it and teach it. It almost certainly didn't have anything to do with turkeys.
Hi, everyone. This is International Dribble, and I'm Chet Kona. If you missed our FIFA World Cup travel previews on Kansas City and Miami, you can check them out in audio format wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube for the video version. And as always, please like and subscribe. But with it being the week of St. Patrick's Day, there was really no other reasonable option than to preview Boston. With around 20% of the population claiming heritage from the Emerald Isle, the most Irish of American cities. To help us talk Boston, past and present, we're lucky, see what I did there, Kelley, to welcome Kelley Leonhard, CEO of the Boston History Company.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Before we begin, Kelley, how do most Bostonians typically celebrate St. Patrick's Day?
Boston has a little bit of a reputation for being pretty rowdy on St. Patrick's Day. We have a lot of pubs, and they're very, very full all day and all evening on St. Patrick's Day.
Sounds good. I was wondering if the Celtics have games at home on St. Patrick's Day, and I think they typically don't for the reasons you just mentioned. It might be too rowdy of a crowd.
Yeah.
So Boston is hosting 7 games, but sadly, none of them are going to be featuring Ireland or Northern Ireland for that matter in the World Cup. And I should also mention that neither Ireland nor Northern Ireland have qualified for the 2026 FIFA World Cup as of this recording. They are both in the midst of separate playoffs, and their participation status for the World Cup will be known pretty soon, in about 10 days or so from now. As for the countries actually confirmed to have matches in Boston, you have Ghana, Haiti, Morocco, Norway, Scotland, plus one country from a group involving Iraq, Bolivia, or Suriname, pending playoffs as well. And then you have 2 countries whose names are going to be coming up more than a few times on today's podcast, England and France. So, Kelley, first question, have you traveled to any of those places?
I have been to England, yeah.
Sounds great. All right, well, let's walk through the games individually. So on June 13th, you're going to have the first game, Haiti versus Scotland. That's going to be Group C. The backstory on this is on the Miami podcast, I referenced Scottish Kilt's accessory pocket that had to be specially approved by FIFA to bring into games because, of course, kilts don't have built-in pockets. I bet you didn't know that, Kelley. So the official name of said man purse is the sporran, and that's what most of the traditional Scottish will be wearing to that game. Norway is going to be playing one of the playoff winners I mentioned, Bolivia, Iraq, or Suriname, Group I, on June 16th. Norway is going to be featuring one of course, the greatest soccer players in his prime right now, Erling Haaland. And then on June 19th, you're going to have Scotland versus Morocco. Morocco is expected to be runners-up to Brazil in Group C. Then on June 23rd, you're going to have England versus Ghana. England, of course, are going to be the favorites in Group L. And then on June 26th, France and Norway are going to be playing, and they are both the 2 favorites for Group I. Of course, France features another of the game's greatest players, also in his prime, Kylian Mbappe. And really, for my money, Mbappe and Haaland are the 2 top undisputed faces of the game in their 20s right now. Not a hot take at all if you look at the endorsement earnings that they both bring home. Then you've got match 74, which is a round of 32 match, winner of Group E versus best 3rd place team from a number of the different groups. I think it's going to be Group A, B, C, D, or F on June 29th. Likely the winner of Group E is going to be Germany. I'm going to just call that right now. And match 97, which is a quarterfinal, is going to be happening on July 9th. The venue is named Boston Stadium, aka Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, Massachusetts. Seats about 65,000 people. It's worth noting that Foxborough, Massachusetts is about halfway between Boston Logan Airport and Rhode Island's T.F. Green Airport, which is outside of Providence, Rhode Island, but we're going to talk more about that in a minute. It's also worth noting that the financial funding dispute between the city of Foxborough and FIFA that carried on for quite a while has just been resolved as of a week ago, with approval for it even just getting ratified a couple days ago on St. Patrick's Day. So that was very recent news. Lastly, I will mention there's a few international friendlies that are taking place in the U.S. prior to the World Cup, and one of those is Brazil versus France on March 26th in Boston, or in Foxborough, I should say. So, Kelley, bringing you in here, big picture, how would you describe Boston culturally, geographically, for those who have never visited before?
Boston is such a wonderful place. It's I'm biased naturally, but It's a really small city geographically. It only covers about 4 square miles, tops, and it has that sort of old European city feel to it in a lot of respects. There's very little of it is on a grid. It's a lot of architecture from the 18th century through the 21st century, all sort of interacting with each other and mixed together. And there's a really great scene around the history, art, and just sort of the all of the cultures that sort of come together and interact in Boston. So it's a lot of fun. It's a lot friendlier than it gets a reputation for, and it's definitely worth the visit, I think.
Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room. I don't really pick up too much of a Boston accent from you, Kelley. So, I mean, I think the Boston accent is very distinctive by American standards, probably not as universally beloved as the British, Scottish, or Irish accents. But I guess where does your lack of Boston accent come from?
My lack of Boston accent actually comes from me growing up north of the city my whole life. I'm from one of the mill towns originally on the Merrimack River, Lawrence, which is not very glamorous as a city, but it also has, I think, a really great industrial history. So those accents, the further out you get, the more they sort of fade away. And younger generations often have this is like a documented phenomenon that our accents tend to not be as strong as like our parents or grandparents. My grandparents did have sort of Boston accents that I was very aware of growing up because I did not sound the same.
Sounds interesting. Well, you mentioned the
Yeah.
industrial history of Boston. It's also worth mentioning that with so many renowned universities, Boston's also, I would say, the de facto innovation hub for the eastern part of the United States. People often think of Silicon Valley on the West Coast or increasingly Seattle in the Pacific Northwest. I would say, from my vantage point, Boston has a lot of the high tech community for the US on the eastern part of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. The Kendall Square area in Cambridge, right across the river from Boston, is our big innovations hub. It's where you're having a lot of companies, biotech, pharma, robotics, AI companies, and all kinds of startups that are settling in and developing right around MIT because there's such a massive amount of research coming out of MIT and Harvard as well, and they're often collaborating together for a lot of these projects, particularly STEM, which is I think a funny thing that a lot of people locally don't think about. We think about the Harvard MIT rivalry more often than we think about the way that they're working together and developing so much research.
Sounds great. How would you comfort or what would you say to international visitors that have some apprehension about visiting Boston or the US for the first time?
It's a totally understandable anxiety to have given everything else that we have going on. And it is a lot to try to keep up with. Boston is pretty tough as nails when it comes down to it. There's the mayor's office and the governor's office as well have been really public about staying on top of what their expectation is and how they're interacting with the sort of larger federal situation that we have.
Well, one thing that we touched on already with it being such a concentration of universities and colleges in Boston, there is such an international community already in Boston. You'll see that everywhere from restaurants to groups within the colleges supporting all the different ethnicities and nationalities that attend those schools. So I think Boston is, I would say, one of the most international cities that you'll find in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many people who come here for their education, for professional opportunities, and generally just to move to Boston. Family connections end up and just friendships and all kinds of things draw people into Boston, and create folks who really fall in love with the city and end up staying here for the rest of their lives.
Well, let's maybe talk about travel logistics now. So if you're traveling in, let's
Mhm.
assume that the three most important places for you would be the airport, the stadium, and lodging.
Yeah.
Describe the airport, the stadium, which is in Foxborough,
Mhm.
and options of where to stay around town and sort of how best to move around between them.
Logan Airport is in Boston, but it's on one of the sort of built up islands in the Boston Harbor. So it takes a little bit of a drive to actually get into the city proper. So budget yourself more time than you think that you need, always, for anything in Boston, I think, transportation wise. Plan for more time than it's projected to take. Give yourself an extra half hour so you're not scrambling. I would say the same thing for Foxborough. Pretty small suburban town at the end of the day. They don't have a ton of infrastructure for lots and lots of people driving in spite of it being the location for Gillette Stadium for uh, the entire time that we've had Gillette Stadium. Um, so it traffic gets really slowed down. There are a ton of restaurants in the Gillette Stadium complex, so plan to just go there for lunch. Give yourself lots of time. Make sure that you have your parking figured out. If you can organize like pre-arranged parking, that's going to be your best bet. And then lodging is there's so much around Boston. If you can get just outside of Boston proper, it's going to save you a lot of money in places like the sort of I guess the neighborhoods like Revere and Chelsea and stuff like that. That's going to be a little bit more economical. If you're really about convenience, there are tons and tons of hotels in downtown Boston at varying price points. There are a lot of really luxury high-end hotels if you're looking to kind of treat yourself a little bit, but they're all more or less going to be pretty accessible from our subway system, even if you're coming from outside the city. That's all pretty well connected.
Well, and just to touch on a couple of the things that you mentioned, the airport is, like you said, on the water, easternmost part of the city. Everything is either west or north or south of the airport.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned staying a little bit further out. There's a few rings around Boston in terms of
Mhm.
highways or interstates. There's Interstate I-95, and even further out, there's Interstate 495.
Mhm.
And if you stay out at I-95 or even 495, you're going to get much lower rates on hotels than you would staying closer into the city from either of those 2 places.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's also lots of places to stay in New Hampshire, in Rhode Island. There's also Airbnb and Vrbo opportunities on Cape Cod. There's even a great webpage called weneedavacation.com. Sorry, free plug for that website, which in my opinion, low key has the best selection of rentals on the Cape. So if you're staying downtown and you touched on it with the Silver Line, the describe what locals call the T, or I believe that's what the MBTA, the
Yes.
Metro Boston Transportation Authority. Describe
Yeah.
that system to me in a few words if you could.
Um, it is America's oldest subway system, and some parts of it really show that. They're the original routes. They don't not ergonomically, they don't necessarily make the most sense to the modern eye as far as getting from point A to point B. Some of them seem like they're kind of taking the long way around. And part of that is because they are. Some of them are just limited in that way. We have a lot of burying grounds in and around Boston. There's all kinds of unusual sort of geographical sort of hindrances to having just a straight line to get you from point A to point B. So the oldest line is the Green Line. That's the 19th century line. And then we have the blue line, the silver line, the orange line, and the red line. The silver line is going to be primarily what runs from like Logan Airport into the city. That is a bus line. Much of the blue line is also a bus line. And then we have our separate commuter rail, which is going to get you um, in and out of further sort of neighborhoods in the city. So you'd be taking the commuter rail down to Foxborough if you were taking public transportation.
Got it. And if you're staying downtown, I would imagine you don't need to rent a car. I would imagine if you're staying further out, like we described, renting a car probably makes a lot of sense. What is the boundary point in your estimation where you think renting a car makes more sense versus not?
It's actually, I think it's farther than most folks would think. I think if you're in commuter rail range. If it makes more sense for you to be taking the commuter rail geographically, then you might want to think about renting a car depending on what you're doing. But if you're in any of those Boston sort of suburb neighborhoods immediately around the city where you have access to the regular MBTA, I would really suggest just relying on the MBTA as much as you can and not trying to drive in the city. City driving in Boston is notoriously difficult and wildly unfriendly to the uninitiated. It is bordering on hostile. Massachusetts drivers have a reputation, and it is for good reason.
And I am more familiar with Boston than a lot of visitors that'll be coming in this summer, and I have also experienced the wrath of Boston drivers, just in the last few weeks. So let me also quickly mention that there will be special trains set up that will take visitors to Foxborough Stadium. These
Mm.
are going to be Boston Stadium trains that will run from South Station in Boston to the stadium in Foxborough, Massachusetts, and will return after the match. So you won't need to rent a car to get to the stadium, even though the stadium is a bit away from the city center. You will need to buy a Boston Stadium train ticket in advance to take the train to the World Cup match. And in addition to the fact that train tickets are limited, you should book them in advance. You must also have a same day World Cup match ticket in order to buy one of these said stadium train tickets. So they are doing what they can to augment the existing transportation infrastructure for the World Cup, but they're also making sure that the seats are limited or are reserved or prioritized for the folks that are actually going to the matches. Let me talk about the other side of Foxborough. So I mentioned earlier that Foxborough is sort of halfway in between Boston and Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island specifically. So the TF Green Airport, which is a little bit outside of Providence, what is your opinion on traveling to Foxborough and flying in and out of Providence as opposed to Logan in Boston?
It's gonna be it's likely to be a lot less busy than Logan is, which in and of itself is a benefit. It's gonna be a little bit less of a project to try and snag an Uber or a taxi or Lyft, trying to get from TF Green to wherever your accommodations are. And Providence is really beautiful. The drive from Providence to Foxborough is going to be pretty comparable. I have not been keeping up as closely as I probably should be with what Rhode Island is doing to prep for the World Cup, but so I'm not sure if they're going to be running any special buses or anything. I wouldn't be surprised if they did. It would it would be a it would make a lot of sense for them to do that. But you're gonna run into pretty comparable travel time between Providence and Foxborough. You might have a little bit less traffic if you're trying to drive coming from Providence as well.
Yeah, I would say if you are going to stay in the Providence area, it probably does increase the likelihood that you would be renting a car. But if you've already made the decision to rent a car, maybe you want to go to other places in and around the area and you had already made up your mind to rent a car, staying in Providence makes even that much more sense because you have already sort of bit the bullet in terms of renting that car and you can take it around wherever you need to go and obviously go to Foxborough as well. Parking for the World Cup matches is its own thing. There's a lot that's been said about that. Make sure you get your parking tickets in advance. They are not cheap. I will just warn you, just like tickets to the matches themselves are also not cheap. But now, since we have the benefit of you here, let's move on to talking about Boston, which really one of the most historically significant cities in the United States. I guess first question for you, Kelley, is why should a European care about Boston and U.S. history?
Um, Boston is so we often get billed as the cradle of liberty. This is the the match in the powder keg for the American Revolution. That and it's starting so far ahead of 1776. We're talking about the 1760s when Boston is kind of starting to set the tone for um, disagreement and conflict with the larger British Empire. So there you can make arguments that go even further back as far as conflict with the crown. for Boston in particular, but for the wider Massachusetts Bay Colony as well. So it's a really politically active and a really highly educated colonial space. Boston has Harvard University almost from the jump. It gets founded very, very early in our sort of colonial period. So and it's a divinity school, but you have people like John Adams and James Otis and the members of the Warren family and the Mathers are all coming out of the Harvard Divinity School. And then some of them are going into ministry, but a lot of them are becoming doctors and lawyers and politicians, and they are constantly in communication with each other. And they are constantly sharing ideas, and these ideas are sort of moving across time in Boston as well. They're constantly going back to the people before them and their ideas and their thoughts, and they're referencing those. So there's this really, really amazing sort of body of work coming from Boston about really holding the crown's feet to the fire when it comes to accountability, expectations, what is or isn't just by the perception of colonial people here in North America. So it's really constant. It's hard to even know where to start. I could start in 1630 and we'd be here for days and days, but it's such a busy and really active space.
Well, and you say 1630s or 1600s, starting before the 1776 revolution.
Oh
To
yeah.
compare and contrast the timeline of US history versus European history, I visited France in December, and many of the quote unquote newer towns that I visited were founded in the Middle Ages, which, of course, started in like the 5th century after the fall of Rome. And some towns like Nice were founded by the Greeks, I don't know, 350 BC, and there's other towns even older than that. North America, in terms of European visitation, didn't really happen until late in the 16th century at the very earliest and into the 17th century. So that's essentially 1,000 years later than a lot of European history. Talk about from a school child's perspective, the story and the impact of the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock. I mean, I can't stress this enough for our visitors. Every child in America learns a sort of simplified and romanticized version of the Thanksgiving story, and it is extremely integral to the American identity in ways very few things are. I mean, so much so, I think Thanksgiving is ranked the second most popular holiday in the U.S., and it's really not hard to find someone where to them Thanksgiving is probably the number one holiday. And I mean, again, to compare and contrast with Europe, right? Christmas is probably number one to most. Thanksgiving is number two. And then after that, it's like think Halloween would be third. And then you get a murky mix of like Easter, Mother's Day, New Year's Day, 4th of July coming after that. So really just to stress the significance of Thanksgiving. I should mention though, 4th of July this year marks the 250th anniversary of the United States. So 4th of July this year, which will be happening during the World Cup, is going to be an extra special affair. But going back to what I said earlier, talk about the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock and sort of the impact that has on America before we really even get to a lot of the specifics about holding the crown's feet to the fire, like you were mentioning.
Yeah, so the Pilgrim settlers in the Plymouth Bay colony, which is originally separate from the rest of Massachusetts Bay, they are a group of religious separatists. So they're a fringe Protestant movement, but their goal is really about a critique of the Church of England. So their belief is that the Church of England hasn't worked hard enough to actually separate itself from Catholic tradition. It's not actually in alignment with the Bible, and they think that it's beyond help. So they're going to go and they're going to do something separate. Other than that, the Pilgrims are actually really hard to set a very specific definition on as far as a group of people. They're coming from a lot of different backgrounds. Some of the folks on the Mayflower are not actually a part of the separatist group. They're here because this is a great economic opportunity if they can actually sort of get their feet under them and really dig in and create a permanent settlement here. But what they're doing is they're trying to prove a point that they can be economically successful and that because they're doing a Christianity the right way, God will favor them. And the rest of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, is going to have to just sit and watch and sort of, you know, figure it out. So you have that happening. They have a sort of tenuously peaceful dynamic with the sort of the local indigenous populations, primarily the Wampanoag initially. And that really only lasts about a generation. By the time the Massachusetts Bay Colony is founded, is already that sort of relationship is already starting to break down by the time you get to that second generation of settlers in Plymouth Colony. The colony is beginning to have sort of infighting issues and is struggling with its relationship with its neighbor, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which ultimately absorbs it. But it's also increasingly anxious about the proximity of Indigenous people and the fact that they don't want to give up any more of their land, even though the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts colonies are both expanding. They're increasing in population size. They need more space, and they believe that God has sent them here and they're entitled to that space by whatever means. So you start to see other Indigenous conflicts. Things are really going to start with the Pequot War. It's going to eventually become King Philip's War, which most Americans will learn about in school in some capacity or other. And then there will be what get just sort of billed under the umbrella of Indian wars in New England and colonial New England, like King William's War, Queen Anne's War. It's going to roll into the French and Indian War eventually, and it's just sort of this constant revolving door of conflict. Initially, with Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay, and then just Massachusetts Bay once that absorbs the colony of Plymouth as well. So it's the idea of the first Thanksgiving is not as romantic as we talk about it and teach it. It almost certainly didn't have anything to do with turkeys. They are the least convenient thing at this point in the colony to try to hunt because they're actually pretty quick and they're pretty aggressive when it comes down to it. So you're thinking things like venison, you're going to have a lot of corn products, the corn meal based things, a lot of fish because they are right there by the water. They're being taught indigenous fishing practices by the Wampanoag initially. And they're going to be really leaning on that. A lot of squash, things like what we would think of as like a Hubbard squash today, which is a really big, dense, this like big blue sort of monster looking squash that needs to be boiled a really long time before it's palatable. But it's things like that that you're going to see at the first Thanksgiving primarily, and it is still a conversation and a negotiation between the English and Indigenous peoples. It's Indigenous leadership sort of saying, "We helped you do this, so you are actually going to invite us in and share that with us," and sort of creating not an equal footing, but demanding a level of respect that's going to be increasingly difficult for them to continue to expect or operate within.
For those that want to learn more about sort of the Plymouth settlement, I believe there's a place you can go. Is it called Plymouth Plantation? I've never been myself.
It's so it is Plymouth Plantation. It's been renamed in the last few years to Plymouth Patuxet, which is to acknowledge the Wampanoag settlement, which was the Patuxet settlement that was also in the vicinity. So that is actually a really great resource. It is a living history museum. You can go, and a lot of the people, particularly the English settlers there, are being portrayed by people who are in character. So they're going to speak to you as though you are talking to a Winthrop. Uh, um, the the very busy and sort of chronically overworked governor of the Plymouth colony, and learning about how they're farming and how they're living, the way that they're setting their houses up, how they're sort of blending what is familiar to them, English style homes and gardens and farmsteads, and also applying the indigenous practices that they're learning along the way and the way that they're practicing their religion, the things that they are worried about and the things that they are hopeful for. And you can also go down to the sort of, you can keep going through that museum and get to the Patuxet settlement. Usually the folks there, they are Wampanoag, Mashpee Wampanoag members primarily. They are not always in costume and character, but they are still talking in great depth, much more about the persistence of these lifeways that have persisted in the face of so much persecution here in New England as Indigenous peoples and the way that those traditions have survived.
Well, I would probably almost always rather have a actual indigenous person versus someone dressed up in a costume, regardless of the situation. So that sounds great. Moving a little bit further north from Plymouth, to modern day Boston, dive a little bit in. You started to talk about this, but dive a little bit into the shared history and impact of England and France, to modern day Boston.
Yeah. Um, the the relationship between England and France is for a lot of its history in the sort of Middle Ages and into the early modern period is going to be really conflict driven. There's this constant push and pull of who has control over what, who has claim over what, and where. Um, a lot of that is going to come from the Plantagenets and the Angevin Empire, sort of moving from France into England, the area of Aquitaine and Burgundy that we think of now, and and eventually subsuming the crown in England, and later as well in Wales and Scotland, and sort of coalescing this all into one united or mostly united island. So there's this constant push pull dynamic. There's understandably a lot of anxiety early in this conflict from the French crown about what it means to have a monarch very close by who is also claiming some French lands and French sort of political power, what that means for the stability of their dynasty and their rule. So you get it's very it's complicated and it's kind of messy sometimes. And what you get is once Spain really pushes this entry into the New World, 1492, Columbus makes his first landing in the Americas. He's landing in the Caribbean, and Spain and Portugal are sort of pushing into South America. Spain is pushing up into the southern part of North America, up through Mexico, into California and Texas. France and England aren't going to push really aggressively against those Spanish spaces, but they're going to aim further north on the continent, and they're going to be competing with each other a lot over land. So initially, France is going to have what is modern day Canada. We are we sort of in the vaguest sense, being just like the English or the Anglo American world, are moving a little bit south, but are constantly trying to push up into Canada as well, largely because of the potential wealth that is provided by the fur trading industry and fur trapping. So eventually we get into the French and Indian War. England will gain all of that space in Canada, and France will retain sort of west of the Mississippi, what we will consider later becoming part of the United States through the Mississippi Purchase and or the Louisiana Territory. But so you're having this constant sort of push and pull. So by the end of the French and Indian War, the French Empire has lost this massive amount of land. There are French settlers who have suddenly become English subjects, which is a big transition to make. And the British Empire has now made a reputation for themselves as having the strongest military in the world, the largest current empire in the world, because they are also active in Asia and in parts of Africa. They are all over the place now. And so they're really threatening to the French and Spanish empires. And France is kind of looking for an opportunity at the end of the French and Indian War, once they've recovered a little bit, to push back, to sort of maybe try again to needle them into another conflict. And the American colonies are at the end of the French and Indian War in the 1760s. They've never been more proud to be part of the British Empire. They've really done something really major here. They've upended a massive and long-standing power balance in Europe. but it was very costly. It was incredibly expensive for the British Empire. So they have to pay for it. English subjects in England and Ireland and Scotland, in other parts of the empire, are facing increased taxes. And eventually, those taxes are also going to trickle over across the Atlantic into the American colonies. And that's really where the conflict begins, here, particularly in New England.
Got it. And I think that conflict and the taxes probably leads us a little bit into the Stamp Act, which
Yeah.
maybe leads to a series of events. Now, I should mention that I'm very thankful to have you here because I have an AP US history teacher that literally lives across the street from me. And if I had to recap US history on my own, I would bring dishonor to the street. I'd probably have to move to a new neighborhood. So we have you, Kelley. So what would you say the roots and rationale for the American Revolution would be from that taxation point that you just mentioned moving forward?
Yeah. So a lot of the conflict that comes up around taxation in the American colonies is going to come from it's going to come from a handful of colonies that are some of the older colonies that operate under corporate charters. So they have a different level of independence than a lot of the later of the 13 colonies. They're originally are often able to raise and enact their own taxes. They have particular liberties that eventually the crown stops issuing to new colonies that become a part of the empire. So there's this fundamental disagreement with what kind of taxes are lawful for the crown to enact. From Parliament and the crown's perspective, any tax that they enact is lawful because they are the law. That when push comes to shove, they're the ones who are calling the shots. They're the ones who are offering protection. They are the ones who have pushed what would be considered the French threat out of the Americas, out of the Canadian territories. And it's time to pay their dues. In prior conflicts, what the British Crown is often doing, or when there are taxes that need to be enacted that will have to go to the Crown, they're effectively saying, you need to raise this amount of money. We don't really care how you get it to us. It can be goods, it can be hard currency, whatever. It has to happen. And this is the timeline that it generally has to happen on. And that is doable because these colonies are resource rich, but they're cash poor very often. So what starts to happen with the stamp acts is that there's this push for the taxes to be paid in cash, in hard currency. The colonies, particularly Massachusetts Bay, are saying we don't have
Right.
that kind of cash lying around. That's not how we function. We're literally not allowed to mint our own money. So where is it coming from? You're not sending us cash, you're sending us goods. We're trading goods constantly back and forth, not currency. So that's initially going to be one of the sticking points. Eventually, the crown backs off of that. But now the colonies are saying, well, we didn't start this war, which is not entirely true. Why should we pay for it? So now you're having Parliament pushing back, saying, we we defended your colonial spaces, your homes, your lands, your lives and livelihoods. You have to participate in the other part of this. Everybody else is as well.
Mhm.
They're saying, well, we also paid for it with our British lives. We fought and died as well. Does that count for nothing? What it comes down to is like, yeah, that's important and that's an important part of it. But the British crown is in debt. They owe money to other allies for this. And there's pressure now that they've won this war to hurry up and make good on those debts. So it becomes really complicated. There starts to be you hear the term no taxation without representation. It gets sort of penned in 1765. That's that's a call for a model similar to the Scottish Parliament that happens relatively recently. It's been around for quite a while. It's well established at this point, but it's in the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively modern thing. And they're saying we don't even have to have our own parliament. We can just have representatives in the House of Commons. That would be fine. And the parliament is just not willing at this point to play ball. Part of this is because the loudest colony that's complaining and griping about all of this is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who at this point has really done nothing but be a squeaky wheel. It's a really difficult colony to govern. They've lost their charter a handful of times. They've been brought under the dominion of New England and had no charter. They've had charters reissued. They've been under military authority before, and they're going to be under military authority again before this is all set. Before this is all over. So it's a bitter pill to swallow, even if for Parliament, it's a tough thing for them to get past when it's the Massachusetts colony in particular being the one who's calling for this the loudest, because they just don't want to keep giving in to them and creating this dynamic where, well, if if they create enough of a fuss, we just cave and we do it. So they think that they can do whatever.
Well, and again, like you mentioned, England at this point has a portfolio of colonies all over the world. And so if they keep caving to Massachusetts, then other colonies are going to start piping up and saying, well, what about us? We asked for similar things and you didn't give that to us. And so I can completely understand England's position, sort of drawing a line in the sand. But then it ramps up pretty quickly, I think, at that point. Would you say Boston Massacre being another key element in this, or are there other points prior that sort of percolate and add to this before the massacre?
Yeah, so there are going to be a handful of things that happen. Things do settle down a little bit after the Stamp Act. A lot of those taxes end up being repealed because it's just so many things are being taxed
Hmm.
anyway. It's not particularly manageable. Parliament does see that there is a point to them saying that like this is not um, a sustainable way to try to tax the colonies. So they roll things back. They're not saying that they're gone forever, but they're going to revisit it and try and figure out something else. So yeah, eventually 17 March of 1770 rolls around as partially as a result of the Stamp Act riots. The city of Boston is under military occupation in 1770. They have been rioting, they have been harassing politicians and tax collectors and some types of merchants and all of these people who are sort of considered to be too close to the crown. It is a destruction. There's destruction of property. It's a, and this is very in the tradition of the sort of British empires, the way that common people interact with the crown in the British Empire is to go, well, if you're going to persecute us, we'll break everything you own.
Mm. Very
We
productive
will make a
approach.
mess. Yeah. So the city is under military occupation. It's really tense. The British soldiers who are there, many of them are Irish. A number of them are free Black men. A lot of them have brought their wives and children with them. So it's something like 6,000 British soldiers and their families in the town of Boston, which at this point is less than a square
Right.
mile. It's a
6,000
tiny
is a
little
significant percentage of the
yeah,
population.
and it's a really small. Boston is a small town at this point. It's wealthy, it's busy, it's a merchant town, but it's got a population under 100,000 at this point. So that's a lot of soldiers to have. And they have to be housed, they have to live somewhere, it's not wartime, so they're all on half pay, which is not a living wage even in the
Mm.
18th century. They have to pick up other jobs. So there's the perception that British soldiers are now also taking jobs away from Bostonians. They're taking usually unskilled labor. They're working on docks, they're rope walks and things like that. So there are a number of other sort of brawls and things that break out in that sort of first week of March and that last week of February. One of them being a brawl like Gray's rope walk, um, which which is potentially important to the Boston Massacre. So March 5th, 1770, there is one soldier outside of the customs house on sentry duty. Group of local kids come up to him and start heckling him and harassing him. He hits one of them in the head with the butt of his musket, and this, I say a child, he's a teenage boy. he he falls down, he gets up, he realizes he's bleeding, and he starts running through downtown saying, "I am murdered, I am murdered. Um, a British soldier has murdered me." This draws people out of their homes naturally, as you would imagine. It draws people out of their places of work. There are a lot of folks, when you think of the dockyards and wharves and rope walks that are in Boston, these are people that are working really long hours. So it draws their attention in. Some of them were probably maybe already looking for a tussle with a British soldier anyway. More British soldiers come out of the barracks that's at this point sort of next door to the old state house and surround him, but they're all backed up against the customs house buildings, so they're surrounded anyway. Now there are, some of the stories say, hundreds of people gathered around shouting things at the soldiers, throwing rocks and sticks and chunks of ice and oyster shells and things at them, goading them to fire, shouting things at them like "Damn you, bloody backs! Fire! You dare not fire! You're cowards!" Things like that. Their commanding officer tells them not to fire, but their their muskets are loaded and cocked. They're ready to be fired at this point. He is eventually hit in the head and knocked down, and one of the soldiers, either having been bumped into or thinking that he has heard his commanding officer give the order to fire, fires. There's a man holding the end of his musket, so he shoots him in the chest at point blank. That's the first man to be shot. His name is Crispus Attucks. He's an Afro-Indigenous man. He was a dock worker here in Boston, and he was also likely an escaped enslaved man from Framingham. Um, he he is the first to fall. He is killed instantly. He may or may not have already had a fractious personal relationship with the soldier who kills him. It seems like they probably knew each other from some of the firsthand reports. The other soldiers, though, they think that they've missed the order to fire, and so they all fire into the crowd. Another four men are ultimately killed. The soldiers are immediately ordered to turn themselves in. They are all tried. There are two separate trials, one for their commanding officer, and then a separate trial for all of them together. They're all acquitted except for two men who are convicted of manslaughter. They are branded with the letter M on the palm of their hand, so that's something that they'll carry with them for the rest of their lives, and the soldiers are all ordered out of the city. Um, this happens over a period of months, by the way, and the soldiers are famously defended by none other than John Adams, second president of the United States
Mm.
and founding father. So there's always these really complicated sort of dynamics that are happening here in Boston as well.
Well, and I believe the Boston Massacre site. Well, first of all, two things. Number one is military occupation plus
Hmm.
repressive taxation plus
Hmm.
stealing jobs plus uh, attacking or injuring youth. Those are all. I mean, really, if you're going to create a recipe for a conflict, those are all tried and true ways to go ahead and do that. So the Boston Massacre site is one of the sites on the Freedom Trail, and the Boston
Hmm.
History Company, I I would imagine, takes visitors on a lot of the sites on the Freedom Trail. Talk a little bit about the Boston History Company, and maybe also walk us through some of the other sites on the Freedom Trail as you sort of continue the story of the American Revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our most popular tour, arguably, is our tour of the Freedom Trail, um, and that's, I would say, and there are a lot of other companies that do the Freedom Trail tour as well. I am biased; mine is our favorite.
Well, I will say
But
this, I mean, just the amount of history you, just put out there. I mean, again, I grew up in the US, I grew up in New England, right? I grew up in Connecticut, and so, very close to everything that you just mentioned, but yet I think I've got a new appreciation for a lot of the events that I've known about for my entire life just from hearing you talk. So I have to say the quality, I would say, do all the guides at the Boston History Company have your level of expertise?
yeah, we take a lot of pride in our guides being really well researched and being really passionate about the things that they're talking about. Our tour of the Freedom Trail the Freedom Trail has existed before any of these tour companies that operate on the Freedom Trail. It started out as something that you would just sort of walk on your own, and there were like information placards and things like that, and a number of museums that were related to the sites on the history tour, that were related to the sites or were the sites themselves that had been converted into museums. So that already existed, and then all of these tour companies have sort of started and coalesced around this because there are so many stories and they're so worth telling. But our tour guides aren't scripted. We don't have a set script for our tour guides. There are the highlights that you have to hit, the primary stories of those sites, but then we really encourage them to do their own additional research and find the stories that speak to them the most, because we find that that's going to be the most engaging thing. If your tour guide is really excited about what they're talking about, that's way more interesting than if they're just sort of reciting a script to you and it's the same tour every day. So every one of our tour guides does the tour a little bit differently. Some of them are really passionate about women's history, some of them about Indigenous history, Black history, maritime history, military history, and, social and economic history, all kinds of things that sort of change the focus a little bit on their individual tour path. So you can go and take 10 different tours with our tour guides on the Freedom Trail and have a pretty different tour every single time,
N-
because you're getting that perspective.
Now, I want to come back to the Freedom Trail, but since you mentioned it, what other tours does the Boston History Company offer?
We operate approximately 32 different tour paths in the greater Boston area. So we have tours in the Seaport, we have tours of Harvard, MIT, the innovations in Kendall Square. We have a special tour just on Kendall Square. We work with Innovation Trails of Greater Boston for their larger format Innovation Trail tour that covers Boston and Cambridge, connecting both cities, Lexington and Concord, Back Bay, Beacon Hill. We have separate tours for the North End, tours of the Museum of Fine Arts, Harvard Art, the Harvard Natural History Museum. I can keep going all day on these tours. So we cover a lot of ground.
You, I would imagine, get a lot of domestic visitors that take various tours. What would you say, what percentage of your customers are international visitors?
I would say it varies a little bit year to year, but it's actually usually a fairly even split. We
Mm,
work a lot with the hotels in the Boston downtown area, so we get a lot of business from their concierge teams
mm.
who have guests coming from all over the world and domestically as well. And we get a fair amount of local visitors as well, folks who have lived in Boston their whole life, have family visiting, and so they thought, well, I've never done the Freedom Trail and neither have they, and we end up often forming sort of repeat business relationships that way with folks who want to explore other parts of the city or into Cambridge and Charlestown and all over.
Got it. No, that sounds amazing because, like I mentioned earlier, just like every school child learns about the Pilgrim's Landing in Plymouth, every school child learns about the Revolution and Boston and so much of the events that occurred along the Freedom Trail. Talk a little bit about the Freedom Trail and some of the other key stops that are particularly popular for visitors, as well as key to the revolution itself.
Yeah, there's so some of the other key sites, they're going to be um, the Old South Meeting House, which is the only original site left that's directly connected to the Boston Tea Party. That's where that final meeting happened, with Sam Adams very famously, shouting that there's nothing more this meeting can do to save the country, which is sort of the signal for members of the Sons of Liberty to go and down to the wharf to destroy the tea. There's the Old State House, which was the seat of Royal British Authority in Massachusetts Bay, and is the Boston Massacre site is right in front of it. That happened sort of right on the doorstep of one of the largest and most important symbols of British power in the colony at the time. Faneuil Hall, the Paul Revere House, which is it's a really neat old house to visit. It is very small, so you want to plan your visits so that you're not sort of squashed in the house because it does get a lot of visitors during its peak season. And the Old North Church, which, famously the lanterns that signaled power beer were hung for one if by land, two if by sea, the morning of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The Bunker Hill Monument and USS Constitution are also part of the Freedom Trail. They are across the river over in Charlestown. But they're also really fabulous sites. And the folks at the USS Constitution, the sailors who are stationed on the ship, and then the museum itself are also they're so wonderful and they're such a tremendous resource. They're really well educated on the ship and its history. Really, all of the museums on the Freedom Trail are fabulous spaces. If you want to learn more about the American Revolution and Boston's role in it, or if you want to just learn about those specific sites as well.
Well, I would say that we know how the American Revolution ended up, but Boston, I would say, in addition to sort of picking a fight with England, has a number of rivals around the US as well. Obviously, New York is a rival,
Yeah,
Philadelphia is another rival. So there's a popular debate, Boston versus Philadelphia. Which city gets the bragging rights for the most historical significance in the United States?
that's a tough one. I certainly don't want to ruffle the feathers of any historical or historian peers in Philadelphia, but I would say that without the rabble rousings in Massachusetts, we might not have gotten as far as the Declaration of Independence. So I'm going to give the point to Boston on this one.
Fair enough. So you're basically saying that Philadelphia isn't even a player until Boston does its part, and so that is fair and that makes sense. Obviously, the when you get into the Constitution and you get into sort of the formation of the United States, or the roots of its formation as it stands today. A lot of that takes place, obviously, at the Continental Congress and in Philadelphia. But yes, I think the roots are laid down in Boston, years before. So I'm going to pivot from history to today. Just for visitors, a couple things. Boston is featured in a number of movies. What is your
Mhm.
favorite movie that uses Boston as its locale?
Oh gosh. There's they're so fun. I think the sort of one of the ones that is to me stands out so much is Goodwill Hunting.
Mm,
The bench, very famously, it's still there in the public garden. It's always, there's always somebody sitting at it trying to get a photo and having that kind of moment. But there's something that one's always kind of resonated. They're all so fun. They're so cool, and they create this really weird vibe about Boston that has stuck.
I,
This like Irish mobster, like very sort of tough, grizzled sort of Bostonian. Um,
Yeah, I would say Goodwill Hunting would have been my choice as well, but if I was to pick something different than you, I would go with The Town as sort of my runner up for favorite Boston movie. Again, when you talk about Irish mobster and sort of a tough, gritty sort of vibe, that the town depicts Charlestown in very much that way.
yeah,
How about food in Boston? So when you think of Boston and local specialties, the things that I think of, clam chowder, lobster roll, fried seafoods, especially when you get to the Cape, cod, scallops, etc. What else did I miss, and do you have a favorite?
we so all of those are wonderful. They're so worth trying if you're able to visiting Boston. We actually also have a really great Chinese food
Mm,
scene here. So there's our Chinatown neighborhood, which is really it's a historically it's a really interesting neighborhood, and there is really, really great food around there. It's also just worth noting that I have heard, allegedly, from people who have lived in other places that like that American Chinese food or that sort of fusion of traditional and American style Chinese food isn't as good anywhere else.
okay. So we're talking egg rolls and sesame chicken and all those sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah, things like Peking ravioli and stuff like that that I think we see on a Chinese food menu and are like, "Oh, yeah, okay, whatever, that's" you know, throw in an order of that, are just not the same in other places.
Well, I can attest to having been to multiple cities in China in my life that none of the traditional Chinese American foods are really found in China. But
No.
again, if you're saying the best of that, which in and of itself is its own thing, is in Boston. I definitely have
Yeah.
to check it out. I have been to Chinatown in Boston, and it is uh, absolutely worth it. Like you say, not just the traditional spots, but there's a lot of modern places. Obviously, there's no
Mhm.
shortage of bubble tea and things like that as well,
Yeah.
all around town, and really all around any major city in the United States. In terms of exported foods, so you mentioned a historical figure by the name of Sam Adams. So Sam Adams beer is something that is very, very popular. Cape Cod is known for its cranberries, its potato chips. Boston cream pie is a thing. Obviously, Dunkin' Donuts is, I believe, headquartered in and around Boston, and you'll see,
Mhm.
Dunkins all over the U.S. Certainly in the Northeast, very much so. What exported food would you say is the most sort of quintessentially Boston?
Ooh. Um, I think probably the most recognizable to most people is gonna be Dunkin', that pink and orange logo. But there's if I can bring us back to the history for but a moment,
Mhm.
we have such Boston has such an interesting relationship with molasses and actually rum
Mm,
production in the 18th
okay.
century, which is one of my favorite things to talk about because it seems like kind of an odd choice.
When you think about rum, you think about, like, the Caribbean, for example. You don't
Yeah.
think of Boston. That's not the first thing that comes to your mind.
Yeah, you think of a tropical drink. You're not really thinking of New England or Boston, but a blackstrap molasses and the rum that was produced from it was actually a major export historically for Massachusetts, particularly Medford, right outside of Boston, had a number of distilleries all along the same street along the Mystic River. That's
Well,
one of my that's the one that I like to talk about.
I would say, again, we'll stick with history for a second. So Benjamin Franklin is often misquoted, I believe, as saying, beer is proof of, God loving us and wanting us to be happy. I think he was more of a wine drinker, but I do believe he also had his own recipe for molasses beer, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, a lot of local folks in New England would have their own sort of family recipes for things like molasses beer or what would get called small beers today, which are low ABV, sort of short-term shelf-stable beer. It's really a way of making sure that you have access to water that is potable and safe to drink. That's a carryover from England, the making of small beers, but things like hard apple ciders
Mhm.
and all kinds of sort of small batch a bowl things that you can do in a small batch like that have a really strong history here in New England. And every family would have sort of a riff on a base recipe like that.
Got it. Well, you mentioned Chinatown and Chinese food in Boston. Are there
Mhm.
any neighborhoods in particular that would cater to visitors from Ghana, Haiti, Morocco, other countries that are going to be visiting Boston for the World Cup?
Yeah, so Boston and sort of immigration into like Massachusetts and the Northeast in general has given us these really interesting pockets in different parts of the city and in different neighborhoods. So the Roxbury area actually has a lot of sort of North and West African foods and Caribbean restaurants because there are higher population densities of more recent immigrants, but also sort of second and third generation families
Okay.
and even further back from that that are in the sort of Roxbury area. And it is really excellent food as well. It's very much worth taking a trip out there to kind of check it out. And if you are from those places, some of the food may look a little bit different because it is adapted um, in some ways, especially restaurants that have been here a little bit longer or from folks who are a few generations removed, kind of adapting and fusing things and sometimes being a little bit more experimental with it. but it's a lot of fun and they are absolutely worth the visit. And it's just great to get folks into those towns and kind of also infusing some of that tourism and visitorship a little bit further out from Boston proper.
And I stand by what I said earlier, which is that because of the colleges and universities in and around Boston, you're going to naturally get a very diverse restaurant scene. And I can even extend that to even small and medium sized cities all across the US. Even if it's a small town, if there's a university there, you're generally going to get a very international food scene just from students coming over, maybe putting roots down and staying there after they graduate, or maybe their families come along with them because again those students are going to want or have a craving for some home style cooking and again in a big city like Boston and of course in a city which has some of the oldest universities and oldest institutions in the entire country, you're going to have that in spades. So very much so. Outside of food and outside of history, what are some other popular things for visitors that come to Boston to do when they come to Boston?
We have some fabulous art museums
Hmm.
that are so worth visiting. The Museum of Fine Arts is incredible. The Harvard Art Museum also uh, an incredible collection, and a little bit smaller and kind of more intimate feeling than the MFA. The MFA is so large it could you could spend days in there. The ICA, which is the Institute for Contemporary Art in Seaport, has an incredible collection, and they're always sort of changing and rotating out what they have on display and special exhibitions that they have from visiting artists and artists in residence. The New England Aquarium is great. I cannot recommend a visit to Myrtle the turtle, our oldest green sea turtle, enough. She's very lovely, and she's in that big sort of cylinder tank
Hmm.
at the New England Aquarium, going on whale watches, heading up, venturing out into Salem, which is beautiful in the summertime and has also fabulous museums, great restaurants, a really gorgeous sort of waterfront area, lots of fun little shops. And I think gets kind of forgotten about sometimes in the summer. It's so busy in October that it's almost, it is overwhelmingly busy in October, but it's got so much going for it the rest of the year as well. Gloucester,
And I
Rockport.
should
I could
mention with
keep going.
yeah, and I should mention with Salem, the reason it is so popular in October is because it is, of course, the home or the location of the Salem witch trials, which is been linked obviously to the Halloween celebration, which goes back to the fact that well, Thanksgiving and Halloween both sort of have a epicenter in and around the Boston area in terms of U.S. holidays that are celebrated. And Gloucester, that shore in that area around there, I believe, we were talking about movies earlier. The Perfect Storm, I believe, was filmed or was the setting of it was that Cape Ann area along that shore as well. So yeah, there's definitely a lot. Talk a little bit about the Cape. Are you a regular Cape Cod goer?
Growing up, my family always went up into the White Mountains in the summer in New Hampshire.
In New Hampshire, okay.
So Cape Cod was something that I got into a little bit more as an adult. But it's beautiful. Cape Cod has some of the most interesting beaches that I've been to in Massachusetts, and that Cape Cod National Seashore is always changing. The sandbars and areas that are so closely connected to sandbars often do. So it's this constantly evolving space. And it's been stewarded so meticulously. The native shorebirds that we have, the seal populations in the summer, the dolphins and porpoises that visit throughout the year and sort of come into the bay. It's just a really, really beautiful place. And the folks are so sweet and so nice. There's the Pirate Museum, the Witta Pirate Ship Museum, which is very cool and very neat. And there's just you can really stay pretty busy. Chatham is a wonderful arts community. Provincetown is a really great little town. It's right on the very sort of end of the hook of the Cape, and it's a really vibrant, primarily queer community. So there's so much in there, and then Plymouth is sort of right on the very. It's almost on mainland, Massachusetts, and not quite the Cape. It's sort of right there on the edge. But there's so much to do and see there, and it's all pretty accessible. It's pretty drivable. There is a ferry from Boston to Provincetown. That's if you can do it, it's well worth it. You could just spend a day out there and have a great time.
Yeah, and especially with the matches being held in Foxborough, you're already kind of halfway to the Cape at that point anyways. And I have this whole theory about field trips that you take when you're in middle school and high school, and the places that you go with your friends at that age bring lifelong nostalgia. And so, again, growing up in New England, growing up in Connecticut, we took a field trip to Cape Cod while I was in high school, I believe. And now I take my family back almost every summer to Yarmouth, Harwich, Dennis, kind of mid Cape. And, sometimes we change it up when we stay in Falmouth, but it's become a tradition, and it's something that I think there's a lot to do in the Cape. We have our list of, and maybe I'll even publish it, in association with this pod. We have our list of sort of top 10 or top 15 things that we love to hit up when we go to the Cape, and whale watching is among the top of them. And the high season for whale watching, or the season where you're going to see them the most, is during the summertime. So really lines up very nicely with the World Cup.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just so much fun. But there's so much along the east coast of Massachusetts that's worth seeing. We could be here all day just making suggestions.
Last suggestion I'll make, probably the height of touristy things to do when you're in Boston: duck tours. Yes, it's sort of a, a tourist thing to do, but you got to do it anyways. It's just so much fun, especially if you've got a family that you're bringing with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Do the duck tour, do the swan boats in the public garden, do all of the stuff that you know, yeah, so they feel touristy. So what? They're really fun and they create really great memories, especially if you're there with your family. So do them. Locals do them still when we have family visiting from out of town. They're just an excuse to go and do them.
Well, speaking of during the World Cup, in addition to the whales being out, the FIFA organizing committee and the local government are going to be scheduling fan fests. So there'll be multi-week. I think it's going to be at least 14, 16 days. There'll be a fan fest that'll be occurring at City Hall, where you can obviously have sort of a World Cup celebration. You can watch live matches, even matches that are not necessarily taking place live in Foxborough, but that are just taking place all over the country. So it's really just a place for people to gather, music, food and drink, watch some sports, hang out with people from all walks of life all over the globe. I think it's going to be a party unlike anything the country has seen, because these fan fests are popping up all over the country, and I think it's going to be. I personally think is going to be the best part of the World Cup for the U.S. is the fact that even if people are not soccer fans and they go to these fan fests, they're going to see how much energy and how much joy and how much passion that soccer fans do have. And I think a lot of folks are going to end up getting hooked by the end of July. I should also mention this is a podcast about soccer and basketball, but on these World Cup City previews, I end up highlighting baseball games because objectively it's going to be a fun and novel experience for folks that maybe are coming from other countries. Very kind of a quintessential US thing. Baseball is considered, the national pastime for the US, although American football is by far the most popular sport. But I say this, and I will talk about the Red Sox here in just a moment, but I will say this to say that Boston is one of the few cities where basketball might actually be going on during the World Cup, because the Celtics are having another very strong year. And if you look at the dates that are already preordained or pre-scheduled for the NBA Finals, there is actually overlap, especially in a 7-game series like we play in the NBA Finals. If Boston makes it to the finals, there will be NBA Finals games going on in Boston in and around the World Cup. So not a claim I can make for most cities, but I can make for Boston. But far from a guarantee that that's going to happen. Other teams, my New York Knicks, will have something to say about that, albeit probably not very much. But we do know that the Red Sox will be playing, and they do play in the iconic and venerable Fenway Park. And it's the closest thing that Americans have to a stadium like Anfield in Liverpool, which Coincidentally, this is not news. Both are owned by the Fenway Sports Group. So during the time frame of the World Cup, you will have over a dozen opportunities to catch a game with teams from Texas, Toronto, Washington, D.C. The rival New York Yankees are coming to town. Probably the only compliment I can pay to the Red Sox as a lifelong Yankees fan is that having been to games at Yankee Stadium and Fenway Park, the in-game experience for spectators at Fenway Park is far, far superior to Yankee Stadium. And with that said, I'll never say anything nice about the Red Sox again. So let's change the subject, Kelley, shall we? Let's talk about the weather. What's the weather like in June and July in Boston, Kelley?
Um, it's pretty variable. Boston has, or New England in general, as you know, living in Connecticut, has a reputation for being pretty fickle. So I would expect it to be pretty warm, pretty humid, especially as we turn the corner into July. But it is be prepared for anything. Have a light sweater just in case there's kind of a cool day at the end of June, but have rain boots, have comfortable sneakers, have waterproof shoes as well with you, and just sort of be on the lookout. You'll need your umbrella and your sunscreen potentially all on the same day. So it's
With
just
Bo-
part of it here.
yeah, and with Boston being on the edge of the ocean, you're going to get that ocean breeze. So that breeze can feel more like a stiff wind on certain days. And usually the switch flips from spring to summer sometime in June, but when that happens is anybody's guess. So to your point about be sort of prepared for anything, but I think once you get into July, it's definitely going to be hot and humid.
Yeah.
Again, tempered a little bit by the fact that you are on the coast. Foxborough is not necessarily along the coast; it's a little bit more inland, so it will be warmer there. But if I look at the averages, I believe 70s and 80s are generally what the highs are going to be. That's, in the from a Celsius perspective. And then probably the coldest it's going to get in late June or early July is probably upper 50s. So that's roughly around 15 degrees Celsius. But with the heat index, which factors in humidity and sun and all those sorts of things, you can get parts of the afternoon that do feel like 100 degrees plus, which is 38 degrees plus Celsius as well. So, like you say, just I would say plan accordingly. Great opportunity to get on the water, cool down, maybe do some whale watching, like we're talking about earlier. My favorite season for Boston, of course, is not going to be during the World Cup. It's going to be the autumn. It's going to be your mid-September, October into early November with the fall foliage and the crisp days. So that's something to look forward to if you love Boston and you want to come back in the future after the World Cup. That's definitely something that I would highly, highly recommend.
Yeah.
So, Kelley, as a tour operator, you deal with a lot of visitors. Again, like we said, both locally and internationally. What is the most common point of confusion to visitors to Boston? Like, if there's one tip you would give a visitor, what would that be just based off your experience?
It's so I know at the beginning of this, I said that it's actually really small, but it is bigger than it looks on a map. A lot of folks think that they're going to be able to do and see everything they want in a day or two. And there's more to see, and it takes a little bit longer to get from point A to point B. It's Yeah, so just give yourself enough time, plan for a little bit of extra time getting, especially if you're this is so it's not as much of an issue if you're trying to walk or take the MBTA, but if you are going to brave driving around other Massachusetts drivers, seasoned Massachusetts drivers, it takes sometimes longer to drive than to walk. The city is not on a grid. There are a lot of one ways. There are a lot of spots where it's you can't get there from here. You have to take sort of a really long roundabout way to get from one location to another, even though on a map they look like they would be 5 or 10 minutes. So and also if you're lost, just ask someone. They will they will help you. They might not look happy about it, but we will help.
Well, and I would also say, like a older city by U.S. standards, you're going to have tunnels and you're going to have places where if you're relying on like a GPS or something like that, your GPS is going to go dark because you're
Mm,
underground for a minute or two. And I've
yeah.
run into those issues driving in Boston before. A little bit less if you're dealing with a mobile phone because that's going to be working on a cellular network, which is a little bit easier. in when you're traveling. So, what is your final word on welcoming the world to Boston?
Just welcome. We're so excited to be hosting the FIFA World Cup this summer. We're so excited that it's going to coincide with our 250th. We're expecting a really big year, and there's so much planned, and there's been so much talk and buzz about this. We're really looking forward to having people visiting and getting to kind of share in the 250th and July 4th experience with us.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the history lesson. Thank you for getting us ready for Boston, Kelley. Thanks everyone for listening. And I should mention, if you're watching this, please note that not every episode of International Dribble is available on YouTube. To never miss out on any of our NBA, European football, or fan travel content, please subscribe for free wherever you get your audio podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, otherwise. And please follow us on Instagram at International Dribble. Send us feedback and ideas to mailbag at internationaldribble.com. That's international abbreviated INTL in both cases. We hope to be back to you next week with another coastal city, but on a different coast. Have a great day, everyone.